Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the 2013-14 season of Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime is a collaborative project between friends of the BU Library, faculty, development, and many other offices on campus. Celebrating learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of fellow faculty, students, and staff. The Primetime schedule is filling in. If you'd like to see what's coming up, check out the homepage of the library website where our events are listed. On Thursday, October 3rd, the Egron Scholars, Dr. Nina Missel, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, Dr. Connie Clark, and Maria Kovaleva will present their research support systems for Somali immigrant new mothers in Minnesota. Today, we welcome Dr. Adam Johnson as he shares human origins beliefs among Bethel undergraduate students. What do the data really say? Let's welcome our guest.
Okay, we got the sound effect right. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. So I'll be telling you a little bit about some data that we've collected on human origins beliefs among our students here at Bethel. But to begin, I want to talk about how we make choices. So behavioral economics tells us that two of the main features in the way that we make choices are the probability that something will happen, a particular outcome, and the value of a particular outcome. And so the way that we make a choice is we compute what we call expected value. So you can imagine that, say, for instance, winning the lottery. Well, it's incredibly valuable, so V is going to be very high, but the probability of winning the lottery is so low that it's really a small expected value. In contrast, you take something like going to work every day. Well, we assume that we're going to get paid for this, so the probability of this particular outcome is quite high. The value of it, much less than the lottery ticket, the winning lottery ticket, but it gives us a higher expected value. So this is why we're going to go to work rather than just trying to buy a bunch of lottery tickets. Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. So these two features are going to be critical players in how we make our decisions. And so we'll have a variety of different choices available to us. We'll compute expected value, and then we'll take the one with the highest expected value. So in some cases, we value something so much that we can overcome that probability that it's not going to happen. And I want to start with this. We'll return to it because I'm really interested in the way that we make decisions about origins issues and human origin stories within a Christian context. So just to give you some basic definitions, we used items from a Gallup poll survey, and in this young earth creationism was defined by this phrase: God created human beings pretty much in their present form at one time within the last 10,000 years or so. Evolutionary creationism, or what I'll call evolutionary creationism, then has this definition. Human beings have developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God guided this process. So this will lump in intelligent design with an evolutionary creationism as well, and so we're going to put all of that under the same banner. And then finally, we've got our third group. This would be evolutionary atheism. Human beings have developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God had no part in this process. So these are going to be my working definitions, and we've just taken these straight from the Gallup poll item so that we can compare our students to the larger U.S. population and data that's been collected over the last 40 years at this point. So the question that we are really interested in, some of the dialogue that goes on within Christian community about origins issues. And if you look at some of the most pervasive arguments that go back and forth about human origins, you get something that looks like this. An archetypal atheist argument looks like this. Religious faith papers over any deep interest in understanding the world. Therefore, religious believers are going to believe rather than looking at something that would ever get them close to evolutionary perspectives. We also have an archetypal fearful theist argument that's going to look like evolution is part of this slippery slope that leads to loss of faith. So don't believe in evolution because you may lose your faith. And so these are quite frequently implicit within a lot of the dialogue that we see about religious belief and human origins. So our question, the question that we really wanted to go after in this study, is to what extent are these arguments, these implicit arguments, a reality across different origins, beliefs, perspectives? And secondly, is this tension and its implicit battle metaphor actually the best way to understand human origins beliefs among our students here at Bethel? Do we really have a battle going on? So, just to give you a little bit of background data, approximately 72% of our students identify as young Earth creationists. And what I mean by this is they agree with that first statement that I read. This isn't, let me give you labels, and you assign yourself one of these labels. It's which one of these three options do you agree with most? We see approximately 27% of our students identify themselves as evolutionary creationists. This changes across students' time at Bethel. And so we see that it's higher within freshman through junior levels in terms of young Earth creationism, and young Earth creationism drops by about 10 to 15 points during their senior year. So there's much less advocacy of this position. So, but still we retain that majority of young Earth creationists here. We've got less than 1% of students that identify themselves as atheist evolutioners or evolutionary atheists. I'll call them each of those things throughout. This is sort of the base set of data that we're working with. Okay, so here's what we did. We gave students a survey. We tucked 6 or 7 questions into the annual assessment survey. This went out to all Bethel students, and we got 1,234 of them that responded. So this is a good sample size. This is a large sample. We can say something with this much data. And we had a number of other things that were embedded within the scale. Our religious commitment inventory, I may also refer to it as a faith commitment. So Joel Fredrickson has done some work on this before. And so this is a standard survey that's been developed back in 2003. It's got good construct validity, things that we care about a lot in psychology. Joel's modified it ever so slightly because our students tend to identify themselves as not religious, but faithful. And so we've moved the term religion to faith. And so I'm using it as religious commitment because that's the formal title of it. But just know this is also faith commitment scale. We've also got a scale called need for cognition. Here are a few items off of it I think are particularly indicative of what this measures. These are to the extent to which you agree with these statements. So I would prefer a task that is intellectual, difficult, and important to one that is somewhat important but does not require much thought. Or I like tasks that require little thought once I've learned them. So the way that you agree or disagree with these statements give you some sense of what we're measuring when I talk about need for cognition. Finally, next we had our human origins questions, so Gallup poll items. We had a couple of other items, basically assessing the certainty that people have about different theistic origins explanations. So these questions, the degree to which you think each of these explanations is true, and we had items that ranged from definitely false to probably true to definitely true. We use this to get at what we would call absolutism with respect to human origins. And so we asked questions about different perspectives, and if you wind up saying, regardless if it was true or false, if you wind up saying definitely, if you wind up at those extremes, we called that more absolutist. If you wind up toward the middle, you're less absolutist. You're couching your phrasing in terms of probably. So this isn't going to single out any particular group or any particular view of human origins. It's just saying you're more out toward the extremes on your answers. Everybody with me on this? Good. Finally, we asked for students to report their GPA. We didn't use a 4-point scale. So when I start showing you graphs and it's up at 5 for one of the groups, don't flip out, and 1 does not necessarily mean, what is that, a D? So, yeah. So those are not necessarily
concerns about grade inflation. Right?
Yeah, it's not grade inflation. It's not any of that sort of thing. So let's just, I want to alert you to that as we get going. So these are the things that we measured. And what we did after we got these measurements, we're going to engage in a couple of different analyses. And these analyses will wind up giving us a different story. Now, we have a standard comparison analysis. For those of you who know anything about statistics, what we're going to do is we're just going to take young Earth creationers and evolutionary creationers, and we're going to compare them. We're going to use t-tests, and we're going to see, is there a significant difference on religious commitment, need for cognition, self-reported GPA, and human origins absolutism. I'd like to point out that you can do lots of different statistical analyses on the same data set, and you will get wildly different stories. This statistical analysis, sort of implicit within it, is that we have two groups, and these groups are different from one another. That may not be the best way to think about human origins issues, particularly within our students. So we did a second analysis, and this was a cluster analysis. And so the way that this analysis works, and I'll explain it a little bit more later, is we take religious commitment, need for cognition, self-reported GPA, and the absolutism with regard to human origins issues. And we take all of those and we say, let's let a computer algorithm tell us what different groups exist on campus. Let's identify clusters within the data. And we'll find, we want 4 clusters. We think that there are at least 4 groups. But let's find 4 groups. And now what we'll do is we'll look at the characteristics of those groups, and then we'll see about the composition with respect to human origins. So this is a different way of casting the data. So we're going to analyze exactly the same data in 2 different ways, and we'll get 2 very different stories out. So hope everybody's with me on this. So let's dive in. We've got a first explanation. This is the straight comparisons. So young Earth creationers have a higher religious commitment than do evolutionary creationers. So on our faith commitment or religious commitment scale, young Earthers are scoring higher. They're also scoring significantly lower on need for cognition. We see no difference in self-reported GPA. We do see a significant difference in terms of absolutism with respect to human origins questions. So what this suggests is that there may be some merit to the argument, if you think too much, you'll lose your faith. And if you believe, you'll stop thinking. So this really does lend some credence to those implicit arguments that we talked about at the beginning. However, these are not terribly strong effects. So the p-values, yes, they are small, but we also have a huge amount of data, which is going to drive those p-values to be very small. So that's our first explanation. So our first set of analyses give us this story. The second set of analyses, let me walk you through this. So instead of saying people fall into these really distinct camps, you're a young earther, or you're theistic evolutioner, or an evolutionary creationist, or that's it, or you're an atheist. So I hope you see, maybe these aren't such distinct camps. So maybe what we have is actually a spectrum. And so we could have something like, I believe that God didn't use evolution at all on one side. And we could have on the other side, I believe that God used evolution all the way through and there was nothing else. And we can have all sorts of gradations of this belief. So you can imagine that people, instead of being put in 2 camps along this axis, they actually vary across all of this. Does that make sense? And then we could have some other variable, and so I've put up there an arbitrary behavioral variable. It could be how much you're willing to pay for ice cream. It could be need for cognition. It could be religious commitment. It could be just about anything. But what we can now do is we can plot each individual as a single point here, and we may have lots of different groups. So just to give you some sense of the way that these 2 analyses will differ from each other, if we've got these 4 groups, and they vary in their human origins views, and they vary on some other behavioral variables, what we did with the t-tests, what we did with the straight comparison was basically say, well, let's slice the data just like that. If you land in that gray area, you're in one camp. If you don't land in that gray area, you're in the other camp. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to take an average, and we're going to get averages, and look, those averages are different. This might not be the best way to slice up the data. So that's the critique of the analysis, the first one. So maybe what we should do is go back to these data. and try to find these clusters. So we used a clustering algorithm. For those of you who are worried about the technical stuff, it was a k-means clustering algorithm. And we asked it to find us 4 groups among our students. And so here are the clusters that we got, and the averages for religious commitment, need for cognition, self-reported GPA, and absolutism with respect to origins. So I'm going to go cluster by cluster. So the first cluster, what we see is very high religious commitment. We see very high, the highest need for cognition among these students. We see the highest GPA for these students, and we see really low absolutism. This isn't saying what camp do you fall into, it's how dogmatic and how absolutist are you as you talk about it. So these I would characterize as ideal, wonderful students. These are the students that I love having in class. They do all of their homework, they've read everything, they've got a really high GPA. They also really like to think about difficult problems. They're religiously committed, they have a deep faith, and they're not going to tell me that I'm going to hell if I disagree with them. These are wonderful students to have around. So that's the first cluster. The second cluster. Well, the second cluster has low religious commitment, low need for cognition, low GPA, and low absolutism. We might characterize these students as disillusioned. They don't want to be here. And so they're not going to fight you on anything, but they're also not going to engage terribly much either. So they're not engaged in the classroom work, they're not engaged in their faith, and they're not engaged in really thinking about things. So I hope that all of these tags that I'm going to put on are just sort of, gotta say something about it. So if you disagree with the labels, that's absolutely fine. If you can come up with a better one, go for it. Okay, so I'll pop the names up as we go across. So the third cluster. So in this case, we've got high commitment to their faith, sort of a middling need for cognition, low need for cognition, low academic achievement, and high absolutism with respect to origins issue. So I'm going to call these non-academic but religiously zealous students. So we might call these zealots. The fourth group, we get high commitment to their faith, so middling need for cognition, higher academic achievement, and high absolutism. So these are going to be a different flavor of zealot. They're going to be zealots that wind up working and doing well in the classroom, but they're not terribly interested in thinking deeply about some of these problems. This might be more of a reactive defense of whatever position they have. Does this make sense? So we wind up with 4 groups. And these groups we've built just based on the data. We haven't we haven't looked at any of what their origins beliefs are. So from the data perspective, we can say, well, anybody, regardless of your origins view, you could be popped into any one of these clusters. And in fact, we have people from all of our different origins views in all of these different clusters. Does that make sense? So now what we can do is finally, now that we've got these different categories, we can say what's the composition of each category with respect to origins views. And here's what we see. In our zealous student groups, so over toward the right, categories 3 and 4, we see a great preponderance of young earth creationists. Approximately 85%, or 86% of these groups are composed of young earth creationists here. Now, the ideal group, we see 62.5% of young earth creationers, and we see 37% of evolutionary creationers. So the majority of evolutionary creationers land in this first group. And the second, so this is the majority, but they still don't represent the majority of that group. The thing I like about this analysis is it suggests that there is room for discourse about human origins issues on campus. There are, in this ideal student group, the students that have done their homework, are interested in thinking deeply, and are profoundly committed to their faith, and aren't absolutist about these discussions. There are a lot of them from both sides of the aisle that are going to be able to come to the table. So I'm going to call this the limited discourse explanation. So we've got 2 explanations. They go like this. So the first explanation based on the first set of analyses that we do, lend themselves to this interpretation of a battle of faith and thought. So increased thinking leads toward a belief in evolution, even if it is a theistic evolution, and a reduced religious commitment. Increased religious commitment leads toward a belief in young earth creationism, and consequently reduced thought. This suggests that there is actually, within the data we have, evidence for a war between faith and thought. The second explanation, which I'll call limited discourse, suggests that there's a large group of ideal students on campus who are religiously committed, thoughtful, and ready to discuss human origins on both sides of this aisle. There are also a lot of zealots on campus from both sides of the aisle. We tend to have more from the young earth creationer camp. Now, there's an important point. The way that we design the study, the way that we put this together, is that zealotry can exist in a variety of forms. Bethel is going to lend itself to a particular type of zealotry. And so we are more open, our environment is more conducive to a particular form, and that happens to coincide with what we call young earth creationism. And the type of, I don't want to say that young earth creationism is zealotry. There are people, individuals within that camp that are zealots. Our community is conducive for them. If we went to a different university, an atheist zealot may be more readily able to move around a secular university. So we'll have a different type of zealotry that exists at a different school. And what we would see, my guess, is a similar type of limited discourse that is available on other campuses. Yeah. So now that we've laid that out, let me bring us back to choices that we have. So the statistical analyses that I just showed you actually differ in their statistical power. That is, how much of the data they can explain. And what that means is that the battle of faith and thought explanation, explanation one, is less probable, it's a worse explanation for the data that we have, than the second explanation on limited discourse. What this suggests is that the p-values change in our decision making. So, all that I've told you today modifies this p-value and this p-value. It basically says that the probabilities associated with these two explanations are different. But we all have to make a choice in the way that we're going to talk about these data and the way that we're going to interpret these data. I've modified one piece of it. What this does is, if you wind up valuing the battle explanation very, very much, even though this probability is smaller, it will still have a very high expected value, and you'll still choose it. If you value each of these explanations equally, what I've told you today should make it so that these probabilities are different, and so you should advocate the limited discourse explanation. And so I'm not going to tell you what you should believe. But what I want to point out is that this analysis and the way that you interpret this analysis actually gives you some indication of what you value and the types of explanations that you like. So there are some of us here who have invested a lot into the battle metaphors. And what I've said today won't alter the preference for that battle metaphor, because there's too much embedded in that and it's too valuable. So I'm not telling anyone that they're wrong. I want to make sure that I've made that clear. These data only tell us about the probability of particular explanations that, in tandem with the value of those explanations to us, give us what our actual choice is going to be. So with that, let me issue a few thanks. So collaborators, Joel Fredrickson, Gary Long, Kyle Roberts, and I got a grant from BioLogos. Cameron Larson is a post-baccalaureate research student. Greg Moravec has moved on, but he did some work with us last year. And Nathan Voss and Kirsten Swenson are currently working with us. So these stories, these explanations, these statistical analyses have developed out of constructive discussions with all of these folks. And so I cannot take credit for what I just explain to you guys. The funding comes from BioLogos. I want to make a little point with respect to that. BioLogos is a Christian organization that is very much interested in promoting evolutionary explanations. We got a grant from them to study how people think about this. I was very careful not to advocate any particular position. I just said we'll do good science, trying to understand how people think. That data will be useful to whomever would want to look at it. Their organization wants to look at it, so they funded us. So if you go through our grant records, if you look at the grant, you'll see that we are mum on any particular origins explanation. So this leads into the caveat. Some individuals tend to emphasize contamination and moral reasoning, even on the intellectual front. And what this means is that a disagreeable idea is often viewed as contaminating a person and consequently their associates. So if I've said anything that is disagreeable to you today, please don't look at these other names on the board and say they have been infected.
Amen.
So, all right. And with that, thank you very much. Got time for questions? Yes, Tim.
This is just a statistical thing. Did you happen to also cluster, for example, not let the clusters define themselves, but did you partition the data by major? Because when I look at this, right, and then I go through the grid of, I wonder who's before me.
Yeah.
And I've taught within my majors, if you will, but I've also taught some courses outside.
Yeah.
And there are times not on this issue, but I notice a different openness.
Mhm.
So I just wondered,
We did look by major.
do you have enough sample size to do this?
Yeah, this is what becomes problematic because the number of different majors you take, I don't know, anybody know right off the top how many different majors there are available on campus? Joel?
About 85. or
About
something.
85. So if you take 1,200 data points, divide them by 85 different groups, if they're uniform across those groups, that means that you've got what, about 30 people?
What if you did it by the three?
You could cluster it by different areas, either
Divisions?
divisions, or there's some other clusters that other groups have, or other organizations have used to kind of put, business usually ends up being its own cluster, but then, a natural science cluster and so forth, and a helping professions kind of cluster, and that is something we could.
Just at first glance, we saw within professional groups, majors, there tended to be a little bit more of an emphasis toward young earth creationism. Within the humanities and sciences, there tended to be a little bit more, but again, the preponderance of everyone is going to be on the young earther side, just because we have more of those here at Bethel. So there were slight differences, so there were slightly more within humanities and sciences in the evolutionary creationist camp, but there's still a minority group. So subtle differences. Nothing that really jumped out. There were some things that we expected. So we took a glance at BTS majors, and BTS majors actually had the same splits as biology. So that was surprising to us. I haven't looked at that data for a while, so I don't know if that's helpful. Does that get toward some of what you're thinking?
I just often just run through the grid of here's what I hear about Bethel.
Yeah.
But I don't teach Bethel students.
Yeah.
I have a slice. So I just
Yeah, that's actually been one of the exciting challenges of this data set, because we do each have our own slice, and then we typify Bethel as a result of that little sample that we have. Victor.
Two things. One, do you think it would matter if if you also look at who these students took, who they studied under?
Yeah.
If that's going to make any change, that's one. Because you talked about how some the seniors have the low variance and the kind of things they're reading, and I think also who they are studying under, who is the general. The second thing is, I think this probably is very trivial. If this research was done not quantitatively but qualitatively, do you think that there will be any? So if we did, say for
Yeah.
example,
Interviews,
interviews,
yeah.
focus group, because your target reader, do you think there's any difference at all?
Okay, so let's go to the first question first. So do people's instructors influence them in the way that they approach these things? Absolutely. Can I ever do that sort of data analysis without it appearing like a witch hunt? No. So that's just sort of the political reality, that if we went through and tagged, oh, this instructor is, it would be fascinating. I think as a behavioral science instructor, I am terribly interested to see if I can excite in my students an interest to think deeply. And I'd love to see, and actually just as a measure for my own teaching abilities, am I actually bumping up some of the need for cognition? Are students making that transfer from, I don't really want to think about this, to, oh no, this is going to be hard, but I'm going to go after it. I'd love to see that, but this is not something that I think is really quite viable. I'd love to look at some of those data because I think that, even within our own departments, there are always divisions in the way that we think about things. And so I think there are going to be some people that emphasize thought in different ways and being able to be, sort of that ironic spirit. And there are going to be others that are going to really emphasize loyalty. So I don't want to just say, these are bad, one's a good way to do it, one's a bad way to do it. Loyalty is an important part of life, and understanding where we come from and our connection to that. And so we have a heritage that has believed particular things, so we don't want to run away from that and reject it immediately out of hand. So I think that all of us as instructors make all sorts of choices that do influence the way that certain things are emphasized. So there are some instructors that do Bible studies in class, really emphasizing a religious commitment. There are other instructors that say, you need to do that in your own time, and I'm happy to talk about issues, but unless you bring it to me, I'm not going to do Bible study in class. So I think there are lots of different possibilities with the way that instructors could influence these data. For the second question, if we did qualitative research rather than quantitative research, yes, I think that there would be some changes. When you give people multiple choice, it's a forced choice procedure. So we gave people 3 different categories. Maybe the better way to structure the question would be something to use a scale, like what percentage, if you think about what intelligent design is, it's evolution with the one exception that God needs to reach into the creation at some point and tweak stuff because it isn't going the way that God wanted or the way that God intended it to go. So it's this sort of interesting mixture of things. And so you could actually say, how many of those do you need? Because for some people they say, well, you need one of those to get humans. Otherwise, everything else is just the product of creation. For other people, you need many of those circumstances. So we could actually, sort of through the qualitative interview, get a better sense of who these are in the camp. So when we talked about those clusters, we could do a better job of making those clusters. The other side of it is, I think we could get a lot better understanding of the way that the need for cognition works and religious commitment works, because these are not singular things themselves. And so we could break that down into something. So there's some people who are really willing to deal with theological problems and to dive into those real big difficulties. But you give them scientific difficulties, and they're done. And so there may be different flavors of need for cognition. There may be different flavors of commitment. So interviews would probably get some of that information out. Now, we certainly would get 1,234 people because we don't have the time for that. But so these data give us a starting point, and I think most importantly for me is the way that I typically hear conversations within this area go. They're really jaded. Those people are this, and I don't want to talk to them anymore. This gives me hope that we've got a lot of room for conversation. It's actually about 1/3 of our students that fall into the let's go for it. We're really ready and we're prepared. So that's exciting for me to see. And it really sort of moves us away from, in my mind at least, the battle of we have to fight. I don't want to fight. I'd rather have a good conversation. Yes, Deb?
You have said this at the beginning, and I'm sorry, but what year the students were in?
These are from all 4 years. We've got a fairly equal distribution across these years. For the cluster analysis and for the analyses that I showed you today, we used all of the data from all 4 years. When we slice it down by year, we don't see many changes. So things are pretty stable. It's freshman through junior year. This assessment occurred at the end of the year, and one of the things that we see, so we see some differences between freshmen through juniors. Should I be using first to third years to be gender inclusive? Okay, so maybe credit numbers, I don't know. So, but seniors are a little bit different. They're thinking about this differently than the previous years. It actually coincides with a drop in dogmatism that we see. So Bethel students tend to be fairly high in dogmatism scales until their senior year. And part of this may just be a reckoning with the larger world. We have the Bethel bubble. It creates a nice buffer for us where we get to interact with only people who are fairly homogenous. And the moment that we are presented with the possibility of leaving it, well, we're not going to be so dogmatic about the way that we approach things. So that could be part of the change as well. Yes?
The social work, historical question, and I'm just curious, how did it come to be associated that you thought God was involved in evolution, that was
You know, this was something that came up. We had a meeting of all of the people who are funded by BioLogo. So we had a meeting this summer out at Gordon College, and we were discussing some of the history. And let me be blunt. There are people who reason in honorable fashion, and there are people who reason in really dishonorable fashion. I want to share with you the things that I believe. I desperately don't want to make you so afraid of the things I don't like that you will come to my side. And there are some people on this issue that have really found a podium that uses fear to bully others into their positions. And they don't actually respect scientific reasoning at all. And they've wound up with some of the largest podiums on the origins issues. And so, here's me being very blunt. What seems to be, so there are very honorable people in the Young Earth Creationist camp. They typically don't have as big a microphone as people in the Young Earth Creationist camp who basically just want to, who say things like, well, carbon dating is absolutely meaningless. That all these scientific reasoning methods that we have, oh, they don't mean anything. And so when you start undermining the reasoning of a discipline, you basically set it at odds. And so you're going to have scientists come back and say, counter with, that's absolutely solid ways of measuring things. We get good measurements on all of these other fronts. Why should this be the one exception? And so it's turned into a war, I think, basically because of the way that some people have tried to undermine different fields of science, which they're not going to win on that front, instead of trying to address the issue. So, from a philosophical perspective, the world could have been created 5 minutes ago, and I could have all of these memories of all of these things I did previously in my life put into my head. God could have created the world that way, and I would never be able to know it. I have to recognize that as a possibility. So to try to say, well, no, absolutely, because I've got all of these memories, that isn't the way it happened, isn't really quite valid. And I feel like there's been some of this historically that different groups have tried to really whack out the legs of the other group by hammering on their reasoning schemes. The reasoning schemes are actually pretty solid. So you see it from the other side with the atheist group, and particularly the new atheists, trying to say, well, we're not doing anything metaphysical here. We're just using science and observation. And you know what? They're using all sorts of metaphysical assumptions that they just don't recognize. But if that's their version of it, you've got it from both sides. And I think it's just one of those things that it's managed to seep into culture. And there are valid vantage points, and we don't know the answer to this. And let's recognize the assumptions of what our position suggests. Yeah.
Adam, I'm just throwing this out as something that really struck me about your data that reminds me of the research me and Peter Jankowski did with regards to religious students and their acceptance of myths surrounding domestic violence and rape, where the tendency is in the culture to blame the victim, exonerate the perpetrator, minimize the damage, and so on. And what we found in our article in the International Journal of Psychology and Religion is that dogmatism, which seems to be similar to your religious zealotry idea, it tends to be associated with acceptance of these myths and in a way, resistance to change.
Well,
And things, and
yeah.
we have, if I may, and we have data which suggests that students change in their acceptance of the myths. They tend to go down over time, and again, the dogmatism seems to be a factor in this as well. So I wonder, is it possible? This is just a question. This is what I thought of. Is it possible that both of us are studying in some ways a similar thing, and that what's really going on is we're looking at change and an openness to change, and how that's related to things such as zealotry,
Yeah.
openness
No,
to
I
thought,
think
things
it-
like that. I mean, that's just...
There is an
I have no
underlying
idea.
factor. I don't think it's openness. And let me explain what I think it is. So there's new research coming out on moral psychology and moral reasoning, psychology of moral reasoning. And Jonathan Haidt has put together a proposal that there are 5 moral foundations. So basically any moral claim can be mapped onto one of these 5. So there's fairness, there's whether it harms someone, there's loyalty to the group, there's authority, and there's purity. And what we tend to see are that progressives or liberals in all manner of societies tend to emphasize the first 2. So don't do anything that will harm people and make sure that it's fair. Conservatives in all manner of societies, religious traditions, etc., tend to emphasize authority and purity. And so what's really interesting, and we've actually got some data on this, starting to look at this, that political conservatives in our student ranks emphasize purity much higher than do political liberals or moderates. We also see much higher moral purity rankings in young earthers than we do in evolutionary creationers. And where it connects to your work is when you talk about the blame the victim, from a purity position, this makes sense. Well, if you have been a victim of sexual violence, you are impure. And so, of course, we have all sorts of rights to be able to blame you for this, because you no longer have appropriate moral standing because you have been made impure, so you're not part of our group anymore because we so value purity. And you actually see this in a lot of the social interactions. So getting back to some of the issues, particularly within our area as Christians, you tend to see fear rhetoric within origins discussions tends to come from this moral purity. I have very interesting interactions with people that say things like this. Well, aren't you concerned that you're going to be on the outside? Aren't you concerned that you'll be rejected from your church? Aren't you concerned? And it's always this fear. Aren't you afraid that people will deem you impure and then reject you and isolate you? It's a really interesting set of discourse. And it comes from this moral reasoning that it's not about what truth is. It's not about what reality is. It's about the in-group, out-group relation. And if people tag you as this is actually why I put it up here, because it's so prevalent through our culture here at Bethel. And so we have this, and this is probably the basis for what you're seeing within your domestic violence reactions.
That's part of it. I think in ours what's a little different too is you have the role of patriarchy where the woman is seen as impure when actually it was the man who was violent.
Yep.
So somehow raping someone doesn't count as being impure,
Yeah.
which is bizarre.
Let's talk about this a little bit more, I think. It's time to go. So thank you very much.